Chapter 20b. Deacon went back to the garden with his creatures, and Mary stayed with Colin. She did not think he looked tired, but he was very quiet before their lunch came, and he was quiet while they were eating it. She wondered why, and she asked him about it. "What big eyes you've got, Colin," she said. "When you're thinking, they get big as saucers. What are you thinking about now?" "I can't help thinking about what it will look like," he answered. "The garden?" asked Mary. "The springtime," he said. "I was thinking about that. I've never really seen it before. I scarcely ever went out, and when I did go, I never looked at it. I didn't even think about looking at it." "I never saw it in India because there wasn't any," said Mary. Shut in and morbid as his life had been, Colin had more imagination than she had, and at least he had spent a good deal of time looking at wonderful books and pictures. "That morning, when you ran in and you said, 'It's come, it's come,' you made me feel quite strange. It sounded as if things were coming in a great procession and big bursts and wafts of music. I've a picture like that in one of my books. It's crowds of lovely people and children with garlands and branches with blossoms on them, and everybody laughing and dancing and crowding and playing on pipes. That's why I said, 'Perhaps we shall hear golden trumpets.' And I told you to throw open the window." "How funny," said Mary. "That's really just what it feels like. And if all the flowers and leaves and green things and birds and wild creatures danced past at once, what a crowd it would be! I'm sure they'd dance and sing and flute, and that would be the great wafts of music." They both laughed, but it was not because the idea was laughable, but because they both liked it so. A little later, the nurse made Colin ready. She noticed that instead of lying like a log while she put his clothes on him, he sat up and he made some efforts to help himself, and he talked and he laughed with Mary all the time. "This is one of his good days, sir," she said to Dr. Craven, who dropped in to inspect him. "He's in such good spirits that it makes him stronger." "I'll call again later in the afternoon, after he has come in," said Dr. Craven. "I must see how the going out agrees with him." "I wish," he said in a very low voice, "that he would let you go with him." "I would rather give up the case at this moment, sir, than to even stay here while it's suggested," answered the nurse with sudden firmness. "I hadn't really decided to suggest it," said the doctor with a slight nervousness. "We'll try the experiment. Deacon's a lad I'd trust with a newborn child." The strongest footman in the house carried Colin downstairs and put him in his wheeled chair, near which Deacon waited outside. After the manservant had arranged his rugs and cushion, the Rajah waved his hand at him and the nurse. "You have my permission to go," he said, and they both disappeared quickly, and it must be confessed, giggled when they were safely inside the house. Deacon began to push the wheeled chair slowly and steadily. Mistress Mary walked beside it, and Colin leaned back, and he lifted his face to the sky. The arch of it looked very high, and the small snowy clouds seemed like white birds floating on outspread wings below its crystal blueness. The big wind swept in soft breaths down from the moor and was strange with a wild, clear, scented sweetness. Colin kept lifting his thin chest to draw it in, and his big eyes looked as if they were listening instead of his ears. "There are so many sounds of singing and humming and calling out," he said. "What is that scent that puffs of wind bring?" "It's the gorse on the moor that's opening out," answered Deacon. The bees are at it wonderful today." Not a human creature was to be caught sight of in the paths they took. In fact, every gardener or gardener's lad had been witched away. But they wound in and out among the shrubbery, and out and round the fountain beds, following their carefully planned route for the mere mysterious pleasure of it. But when at last they turned onto the long walk by the ivied walls, the excited sense of approaching thrill made them, for some curious reason they could not have explained, begin to speak in whispers. "This is it," breathed Mary. "This is where I used to walk up and down and wonder and wonder." "Is it?" cried Colin, and his eyes began to search the ivy with eager curiousness. "But I can see nothing," he whispered. "There is no door." "That's what I thought," said Mary. Then there was a lovely, breathless silence, and the chair wheeled on. "That is the garden where Ben Weatherstaff works," said Mary. "Is it?" said Colin. A few yards more, and Mary whispered again. "This is where the robin flew over the wall," she said. "Oh, is it? Oh, I wish he'd come again." "And that," said Mary with solemn delight, pointing under a big lilac bush, "is where he perched on the little heap of earth and showed me the key." Then Colin sat up. "Where? Where? There?" he cried, and his eyes were big as the wolf's in Red Riding Hood when Red Riding Hood felt called upon to remark on them. Deacon stood still and the wheeled chair stopped. "And this," said Mary, stepping onto the bed close to the ivy, "is where I went to talk to him, and he chirped at me from the top of the wall. And this is the ivy the wind blew back," and she took hold of the hanging green curtain. "Oh, is it? Is it?" gasped Colin. "And here is the handle, and here is the door. Deacon, put him in quickly, push him in quickly." And Deacon did with a strong, steady, splendid push. But Colin had actually dropped back against his cushions, even though he gasped with delight, and he had covered his eyes with his hands and held them there, shutting out everything until they were inside and the chair had stopped, as if by magic, and the door was closed. Not till then did he take them away and look round and round and round, as Deacon and Mary had done. And over the walls and earth and trees and swinging sprays and tendrils, the fair green veil of tender little leaves had crept, and in the grass under the trees, and the gray urns in the alcoves, and here and there and everywhere were touches or splashes of gold and purple and white, and the trees were showing pink and snow above his head, and there were fluttering wings and faint sweet pipes and humming and scents and scents. And the sun fell warm upon his face like a hand with a lovely touch. And in wonder Mary and Deacon stood and stared at him. He looked so strange and different, because a pink glow of color had actually crept all over him, ivory face and neck and hands and all. "I shall get well. I shall get well," he cried. "Mary, Deacon, I shall get well, and I shall live forever and ever."